You're listening to episode 54 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Today's show is all about vegan diets. Now, I'm not a vegan, nor am I a vegetarian, but I do find myself eating plant-based meals most days of the week. I wanted to learn more about vegan diets, and it turns out that so did many of you. And so I turned to cookbook author, blogger, and dietitian-to-be Gena Hamshaw for the answers to all of my questions and yours. Gena's latest cookbook is called Power Plates, 100 Nutritionally Balanced One-Dish Vegan Meals. She's also the author of Food 52 Vegan and Choosing Raw. And she's the voice behind the gorgeous and delicious food blog, The Full Helping. You need to check that out. The pictures in and of themselves are so beautiful, and I know you're going to love her website. So head on over there. But in the meantime, Gena's here with lots of tips for getting started on your vegan eating and lifestyle journey. She's got the scoop on all those plant-based milks that you're probably seeing popping up in the supermarkets. You know, oat milk, almond milk, peanut milk, you name it. She's got important rules of the road when it comes to getting the right balance of nutrients on a vegan diet. And of course, we have lots of recipes we're going to talk about, including Gena's spring panzanella salad with artichokes, asparagus, peas, and lemon dill vinaigrette, and her cauliflower scramble, which is an easy substitute for scrambled eggs. We are giving away a copy of Power Plates to one lucky winner, so head to lizshealthytable.com/podcast to enter for a chance to win. That is U.S. only, please. Also, on the Liz's Healthy Table blog, you will find Gena's panzanella salad recipe. Beautiful, easy. I want you to try it. You're going to love it. I adore this cookbook. And the next recipe I plan to make is Gena's sesame citrus soba salad. I like the sound of that. Sesame citrus soba salad. Before we get started, don't forget to join Liz's Podcast Posse, which is my closed group on Facebook. Anyone can join. You can link over to it from the podcast page on Liz's Healthy Table. Liz's Healthy Table is brought to you by my friends at superhealthykids.com, your one-stop shop for recipes, meal plans, cooking videos, and tips for feeding kids of all ages. My show is also brought to you by the Parents on Demand Network. This is an app. You can download it to your phone. It is filled with parenting podcasts like PediaCast with Dr. Mike. I've been on his show. Mike has been podcasting since 2006. He covers every topic under the sun that's important to parents and grandparents. Be sure to check out the app over at parentsondemand.com. While you're there, you can learn all about the different shows in the network, including PediaCast and my show. Is a vegan diet the right fit for you and your family? Are you curious how to bake muffins without eggs or how to turn tofu into something spectacular? If you are, then Gena Hamshaw has you covered. Hey, Gena, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
So before we dig in, could you tell everybody just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professional blogger. I've been writing my blog, which is called The Full Helping, since 2009, which is almost a decade now. And I love writing about food. I'm vegan, so I write about vegan food and vegan living and lifestyle and nutrition. And I'm also currently a dietetic intern, so I'm on my way to becoming an RDN. I'm in my internship year now. So I'm in a juggling act between running my little online business and also studying clinical nutrition.
And I can relate to that whole dietetic internship, and mine was in 1982, so quite some time ago out in Portland, Oregon, and I know things have changed a lot. So, hey, good luck with that internship.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint, as everyone always reminds me.
Well, I'm excited you're going to become a registered dietitian, and then I will get to see you at our professional conferences. So that's something to look forward to.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a book. You have several books, but the cookbook that's sitting right in front of me is called Power Plates, and it's a vegan cookbook. On page 1, you talk about balanced vegan meals, because I think a lot of people, when they think of vegan, they think, oh, there's so many like nutrients I'm going to have to worry about. I'll never be able to balance it out. So what's your philosophy on balance? Talk about how you kind of guide people through becoming a vegan or just embracing a vegan diet.
Yeah, so for me, the balance idea is really all about macronutrients. And the story behind that is actually, so one of the old stereotypes you might have heard about eating vegan is the sort of carbitarian stereotype. So like someone takes meat out of their diet and all they eat is pasta or bread or whatever. I'm sure that that stereotype has its roots in some sort of truth. But actually, in many years of working in the plant-based space, what I've seen is the sort of more of like, I guess I would call it like the salad vegan stereotype, which is that people take the animal proteins out of their diets and they just eat a ton of vegetables. And I think obviously it's always great to load up on the fruits and veggies, but you know, if you're going to be vegan for the long haul, if you're going to be vegan and remain vegan and really feel your best and thrive and be satisfied with the diet, I think making sure that you get enough protein and enough complex carbs and enough healthy fats is really essential. You know, these are the building blocks that keep us satiated and do lots of incredible things for our body. I think it can be difficult when you become vegan to really know how to make that balance work, because most of us, myself included, grew up with the sort of traditional paradigm of like an animal protein, a starch, and a vegetable on their plate, right? And so in the absence of that, that idea of sort of what is a balanced meal, what does a balanced dinner look like, can be really tricky. And so the goal of the book was essentially to show people how to create that balance with plant-based ingredients, whether or not you're someone who's already eating plant-based and just trying to optimize things so that you feel a little more energized or a little more satisfied with the diet, or whether you're just a curious omnivore who's looking to do more meatless meals but doesn't really know how to achieve that nutritional balance for yourself or for your family.
So if you were to walk in the door then and just whip together a quick vegan meal, and you've got the protein and the good fats and you got the carbs, you know, those macronutrients, what might one of those meals look like?
Well, so I do a lot of what I like to call a grain, a green, a bean, a sauce around here, which is essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's just a whole grain, some sort of legume, whether that's lentils or chickpeas or black beans, some kind of green vegetable, and maybe some other vegetables thrown into the mix, and then some sort of nutrient-dense sauce with healthy fats. That is probably my dinner strategy at its most basic. But I also do a lot of tofu and tempeh around here. I'll often do like a baked tofu and tempeh with some sort of vegetable and whole grain. And that would be also a kind of balanced meal. I do a lot of pasta with a vegan protein, whether that's tofu, tempeh, beans, or a vegan meat like the Beyond Chicken or the Beyond Beef crumbles thrown in with a sauce and some veggies. So those are some of my sort of quick go-to dinners at home.
And I will tell you, I love that Beyond Beef product.
So good.
Oh my gosh, those crumbles. I have a recipe on my blog. It's a spaghetti squash. Of course, that's not in season now, but you roast it and then you top it with this meat bolognese, but it's really made with the Beyond Beef and sauteed mushrooms. It is so good.
Yeah.
I'm a groupie. I'm with you on that one. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but tempeh, you mentioned tempeh. And for listeners, you know, I think most people know what tofu is, but what's tempeh and how would you use it in a vegan dish?
So it's also a soy product, which is why it's kind of a cousin of tofu. But tofu is really, the beans are all broken down and then they're strained out to sort of leave this curd behind, which is the smooth block of tofu that we end up with. Tempeh has a much denser, sort of meatier, coarser texture because the soybeans are left more whole. And it's actually a fermented food. So traditionally, I believe, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I think this is true, I think traditionally it was wrapped in banana leaves and allowed to ferment that way. Nowadays, I'm sure the fermentation process works a little differently and is scaled up. but it is still a fermented soybean sort of cake or brick, if you will, that then has this really lovely dense texture. It's a little more protein rich than tofu is, ounce for ounce. And I just really like it because I find it very satisfying and hearty. I love tofu as well, but tempeh is a little bit meatier, so to speak.
And how would you use it in a recipe? You know, share a recipe out of the book that uses tempeh.
Yeah, actually, I made one of them last night. There is a polenta dish with a balsamic glazed tempeh and vegetables on top. I make that one all the time. And it's really just you pan-sear the tempeh, and then you add some balsamic, and you reduce it into sort of a thick glaze, along with some onions and peppers, and you serve that over the polenta. But sometimes I just marinate and then bake tempeh cubes, just to throw onto salads or to mix into a whole grain or do whatever I'm going to do. And sometimes I will sort of cut it into very thin slices and marinate it with some smoked paprika and tamari and vinegar and maple syrup. And that actually makes a really great plant-based bacon, which you can then sear up in a cast iron skillet or bake in the oven or do whatever you want to do. And I'll serve that with like a tofu scramble and a piece of toast or something like that.
You know, people think vegan cooking is so hard and complex and takes forever. I think you live in a tiny New York apartment and you make it happen. Isn't that right?
True. It's true. And I guess tiny is all relative, right? Like when I compare my kitchen now to my first kitchen when I was fresh out of college, it's definitely a lot roomier. But New Yorkers, in comparison to most folks around the country, definitely have less kitchen space, and mine is pretty small. So yeah, I don't think that vegan has to be that complicated. I do think there's a learning curve though. So I think that as with any way of cooking, even just teaching yourself how to cook in general, it takes time. Not everything's going to feel intuitive at first. Of course, you're going to have some recipe flops. That's how you learn in the kitchen. And certainly there's just a new cast of characters to get to know in terms of like the basic ingredients. So if you've always cooked with chicken or fish, it takes a little while to figure out how to make tofu and tempeh. They taste better when you marinate them. You know, there are little tricks of the trade to make them more palatable. And working with beans and different whole grains, if that's all new to you, there's certainly going to be a learning curve. So I think that you do have to invest a little bit of time into figuring the whole thing out. But I think once you do, it's actually every bit as simple and intuitive as any kind of cooking can be.
You know, when I think about plant-based eating, you used that term earlier, I think about my diet, which is sort of more Mediterranean. And I do eat fish and meat and chicken, but small amounts, and it's mostly plant-based. But then I hear a lot of vegans talking about plant-based as their style. So I don't know if there's really a definition for plant-based, but in your mind, is plant-based vegan? And why'd you become a vegan?
In my mind, they're actually not the same thing. Okay. And I don't like to get too nitpicky about it because the words can be used interchangeably. So to some people, plant-based and vegan are one and the same. And I think that there is some amount of subjectivity here, but I can tell you my own sort of understanding of the terminology, which is that plant-based means just that. It means you're eating a diet that is mostly plant-based ingredients or almost entirely plant-based ingredients. In my mind, that can certainly allow for small amounts of animal proteins, whatever those might be. So a plant-based eater could be someone who eats an entirely plant-based diet, but it might also be someone who eats more along the lines of what you just said, which is you're eating small amounts of animal protein. And in my mind, that term really does refer exclusively to the way one eats. To me, vegan really does mean a lifestyle in which you are, to the best of your ability and the best of your knowledge, excluding all animal products from your diet. And it's also a lifestyle as opposed to just an eating style. So you're also not buying leather, you're not buying wool, you're avoiding cosmetics that have been tested on animals or made with animal products. You're just sort of bringing the whole ethos of not commodifying animals to your entire lifestyle as opposed to just the way you eat. I identify as vegan because that's really how I treat it. The diet itself is just one part of a larger kind of ethic of compassion for animals for me. And that's why I don't use the word plant-based. But sometimes when I'm just speaking colloquially, I'll use plant-based to describe a recipe itself. And I think a lot depends on the context, too. Plant-based is more recognizable to some folks, whereas vegan is more recognizable to others. So I do get a little loosey-goosey in the way I use the words, but I think if you ask me for a definition, they do mean different things.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're in agreement then. Yeah. So when it comes to a vegan diet, what are the nutrients of concern? Like, what are the nutrients that might be missing? For example, the one that comes to my mind is omega-3. Like, you find the long chain omega-3 fatty acids in things like salmon and sardines and seafood. I know you can get omega-3 from plants as well, but it's not as powerful. So, like, what are those nutrients of concern, and what are your tricks for working around those concerns?
This is when I love talking to fellow dietitians. I think it's great that you point that out. I do think there are nutrients of concern. I don't think it's just as easy as removing all animal products from your diet and you're good to go. I do think that there are some considerations to keep in mind. One is B12. So that is a vitamin which it is truly not possible to source adequately just through food. Even if you're getting fortified nut milks or soy milk in your diet, it is really still advisable for vegans to take a supplement. And that is sort of just a bottom line, and it is something I always encourage a new vegan to consider. If you're plant-based and you're still including some animal products in your diet, that might give you more wiggle room to not supplement, but really my advice to any long-term plant-based eater, and certainly to vegans, is to take the B12 supplement. It's really important. And you're right also to bring up the omega-3 fatty acids. Obviously one can get some through walnuts and flax seeds, but the DHA is really what's tricky. The DHA is sort of a fatty acid that our bodies can convert from things like flax seeds, but it's tricky, and we don't convert a ton of it. And so there are some vegan dietitians who do recommend considering a supplement just upfront of DHA specifically. So not just of omega-3s, not just like a flax oil supplement, but really an algae-derived DHA supplement, which would bring you closer to what you would be getting if you were including seafood in your diet. I don't know that we have evidence to say for sure that all vegans need to supplement a vegan DHA. I don't really know that we can make that case based on the literature that we have. But do I think it is a bad idea for vegans to just take a vegan DHA supplement, something around 200 milligrams a day? Probably not. I don't think that's a bad idea. I think it's a kind of good insurance policy. So that's one. Like all folks, I think vegans need to think about vitamin D. That is a concern for most people nowadays if we don't get a lot of direct sunlight. But I think because vitamin D can be tricky to source in a vegan diet, even if you are having those fortified nut milks or soy milks, I do think that that's a good one to consider as well. And then the only thing I would say is that vegans don't need to supplement, but they should be mindful that they're getting enough zinc and calcium and iron. Those are the other three. Those I don't think necessarily need to be supplemented, but I do think that vegans should just familiarize themselves with some of the best vegan sources of those foods and make sure they're loading up every day so that they really are getting enough. Because again, if you're used to, for instance, getting most of your iron through meat or most of your calcium through dairy products, it's going to take a little while to figure out how to get the same amount through plant foods. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily any less efficient. All it means is that you're going to have to trade in some of the things you used to eat for new things and make sure you're sort of meeting those same needs.
Right. Reading labels, doing your homework. And I will say, too, that B12 is important for a healthy nervous system, right? So just wanted to remind people of that as well. Absolutely. So let's say you're a mom and you're listening to the show and you're kind of embracing more of these plant-based recipes and this more plant-based diet, and you want your kids to join you on that journey. So, you want to make healthy meals that you think your kids are going to love. So opening the pages of your cookbook, what might be a recipe that somebody tries first with their kids to say, all right, we're not having our typical American diet. It's Meatless Monday, and we're really going meatless tonight. So what might be a recipe you would recommend from Power Plates that moms should try first?
So one of the ones that I think I've heard that kids can like, even though it has mushrooms, which I'm not sure is
I love mushrooms.
Food, but yeah, it's certainly a food I love, is the creamy brown rice with shiitakes and peas. It has a really nice creamy texture. And I've heard from some of my readers who are parents that their kids really like that one. So that's a really good one. The pasta, the creamy roasted red pepper sauce pasta with broccoli rabe. I don't know that broccoli rabe is most kid friendly, but what you could do with that recipe is make the pasta with the creamy roasted red pepper sauce and just substitute whatever vegetables your kids are going to enjoy or you're trying to encourage them to eat more of. That one I think is definitely a kid-friendly choice for sure. I think some of the soups would be good options. And then some of the bakes, which is like the last chapter of the book, there are definitely some family-friendly recipes in that chapter. So I love the spiced lentil tamale pie. I think it's delicious. You could certainly tone the spiciness down so that it has all of that savory flavor, but isn't too spicy for little ones. The baked potatoes with broccolini and white beans are delicious, and like they definitely register as like a comfort food dish. There are enchiladas, which I think are great crowd-pleasing recipes, and that's one that I turn to a lot when I'm having friends over, I'm just feeding a crowd. They're a good one to freeze ahead of time. So those are some of my favorite, family-friendly picks from the book for sure.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So many good recipes. So you've got a breakfast chapter, and I am personally like a huge lover of eggs. So on a vegan diet, obviously you don't eat eggs. So what could you do instead of, say, scrambled eggs? And then, what kind of recipe would you recommend? Because I know you have one in the book. And then when you're baking or making muffins or pancakes, what is sort of that vegan egg substitute? Give us the secret formula.
Actually, my standard for replacing eggs is tofu scramble. And I say that because there's not really a tofu scramble recipe in this book per se. There is in my second cookbook, which is Food 52 Vegan. I like the tofu scramble because it's incredibly fast and easy, and actually because I think, nutritionally speaking, it's the best substitute. It's got those healthful fatty acids, and it's got the right amount of protein to really serve as a good replacement for an egg scramble. But that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of other things you can do. So cauliflower scramble is one. And in Power Plates, my cauliflower scramble has some chickpeas thrown in, so it actually does have like a protein source folded into the mix for sure. And that's a really good one. There's also a tofu migas recipe in Power Plates, which is similar to a scramble, but you include sort of cooked down tortillas in it. It's very delicious and a great savory breakfast option. So those are some of my favorite go-tos. But, you can really create a scramble with lots of different kinds of proteins. I've even done one with like chickpea flour instead of chickpeas themselves, and it worked out pretty nicely. So you can get creative. And then with baking, it's funny. I used to be just a total stickler about the idea that if you were going to bake vegan, you had to replace the egg. So I would always add a flax egg, which is just ground flax meal mixed with water, to my muffins, my banana bread, anything I baked. And I think that a flax egg does work really nicely. But what I've realized over time is that in a lot of recipes, especially if they only call for like one egg or maybe two, and especially if it's a quick bread, like a muffin or a loaf of zucchini bread, banana bread, whatever, you don't actually really need to replace the egg. Oftentimes, the recipe will turn out just fine without it. I think it's a little trickier when you're baking both without eggs and without gluten. In that case, I do think you have to think a little harder about replacing eggs. But it's incredibly easy to bake without them a lot of the time. And it really depends on the recipe you're converting, right? So if a recipe calls for like 3 eggs, that's when I would start thinking harder about how to replicate what eggs are doing in that recipe. But oftentimes you can get away without replacing one. And if you are going to replace it, flax egg is a great option. Another good one is aquafaba, which is the liquid in a can of chickpeas. After you've strained out the chickpeas, there's this liquid left behind. And if you sort of whisk it up lightly, it can turn into a very good replacement for eggs. And there are actually all sorts of cool things you can do with it. Like you can put it in a stand mixer and whip it into soft peaks, just as you would with eggs. It's pretty magical. I don't work with it a ton, but every time I've tried, I've been impressed with how well it does.
I can remember when the aquafaba, yes, right? It was like this huge trend on social media. Hilarious.
It took over. It took the world by storm.
It did. I love all these little trends like bowls, bowl meals. I feel like that trend has stuck around, right?
Yes, definitely.
And, it's funny when I look at your book, Power Plates, I'm like, hey, there's a lot of power bowls in there too. Come on, let's not shortchange the book. And I love bowls. I love bowl meals. And before we talk about your Panzanella salad, which I made for dinner last night, I just want to address some questions from the Podcast Posse, because I always will, not always, but, oftentimes I'll say, hey, I've got such and such a guest coming on the show. What questions do you have? And so when I posted the other day that you were coming on the show, Mary, who's one of my Podcast Posse members, she said, I never know what milk to swap for dairy in different recipes, like soups or baking, without changing the flavor too much. So are there any sort of rules of thumb about if a recipe calls for, cow's milk, what you should substitute it with, or is that more of a personal preference?
I think it's a combination of both. I do think personal preference has a lot to do with it. You know, if you just hate the taste of almond milk, for example, but you love the taste of cashew milk, that is going to direct your choices for sure. I also think how you're using the milk has a lot. It will certainly inform which one you choose. And I always say this to parents. If you're looking for just an everyday replacement for, say, a glass of milk or milk and cereal in your child's diet, or even just if you're replacing what dairy has sort of like been as a go-to for you in your diet, I think soy milk is always my go-to option, only because, again, the protein, the fatty acids, I think it's the most comparable to regular dairy in terms of nutrition. And so that would be my go-to choice as a sort of just direct one-to-one replacement for dairy, again, especially if you're working with little kids. With all of that said, when it comes to just cooking and culinary uses, I think a lot depends on the recipe. I like soy milk and cashew milk and coconut milk in soups because they're rich and they have a very creamy texture, and I feel like they just work really well in a creamy soup. I have always liked almond and cashew milk in things like smoothies, just lighter recipes, or if I'm making like a vegan hot chocolate, I'll really like almond milk. And then right now for coffee beverages, like for a good, delicious vegan latte, I have to admit, I think there's a lot to be said for the oat milk craze. I think that for coffee in particular, oat milk does just a really nice job of creating the same creamy texture, and it just blends really nicely into espresso drinks. So I think that's a good one. And then the other thing I always encourage people to remember is fortification. So there are some new nut milk brands on the market that have wonderful textures, almost as if you were to make them at home, you know, like a really authentic, almost homemade, very minimal ingredient label texture. And that is the great thing. But some of them aren't fortified. So again, you need to think, is this just something I'm sort of adding to my diet to make a hot chocolate or a latte or a fun recipe? Or am I going to be relying on this to do for my body nutritionally some of what milk has done in the past? If that's what you're doing, you do need to, I think, seek out the fortified options, just because that way you're getting the calcium, the D, and the B12.
Mm-hmm. Such good advice. And I'm going to add to that and say read labels and make sure there's no added sugar, because a lot of these milks, just like cow's milk, can be flavored, right? It could be chocolate milk or vanilla milk, and now they're dumping in, teaspoons of sugar. So kind of beware of that too.
Absolutely. That's a really great point.
Yeah. Okay, so Miranda says that she is interested in your favorite ways to use beans and lentils. She says, I'm not vegan, but these are some of my favorite protein ingredients, and I know they can be really nutritious. So give us a bean idea or a lentil idea, or one of each.
Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah, and I think to your point, Miranda, a lot of folks, including folks who are just very contented omnivores, are trying to incorporate more legumes into their diets these days, because we just know that they're so nutritionally rich and they're a sustainable protein source. So I think any amount of experimenting you do with beans and lentils is awesome for all of us. And, I use them in every which way. I think generally for things like a quick protein source onto a salad, beans are really my go-to. That's pretty much something I put in almost every bowl I make, including my everyday lunch bowls, some of the meals I pack up and take to work as an intern. There's almost always a bean thrown in, whether that's black beans, kidney beans, pinto, chickpeas, you name it. I do also love incorporating those ingredients into like grain pilaf. So if I'm just trying to add some protein to a rice pilaf, say, I would just fold in a cup of beans and just give it a little extra nutritional boost. And I often add beans to pasta, right? So instead of adding traditionally what would be maybe a meat or seafood or some other animal protein, I'll just throw some beans into the mix. With lentils, I think you can do any of those same things, but lentils are also, because they're smaller, I think that there are some other cool things you can do with them. So I really love to add them to pasta sauce. The red lentils cook down really fast. They become very mushy, which means they can almost sort of disappear into soups and sauces. So I often add red lentils to my marinara sauce. There's a recipe like that in Power Plates. And it's just a great way to add protein and nutrition to an otherwise just everyday sauce. And that's one of my favorite things to do with lentils for sure. I also sometimes blend lentils up as I would chickpeas for hummus, and I turn them into a nice creamy dip. It's just a hummus alternative that can be fun. And that's another good thing to do with them.
And, the lentils cook up so quickly. And that was a question from Helen. She was sort of like, doesn't it take forever to cook lentils? But lentils, unlike beans, like I tend to rely on canned beans because I'm a little bit lazy. And I always drain and rinse them to wash away some of the sodium. But lentils cook.
Both, sister.
Yeah.
Yeah, I rely on them myself, yes.
But the lentils, they cook up quickly. I think it's a myth that they take forever to cook.
They don't. And, of course, it depends on the lentil, right? So I have found that, like, the black lentils, the beluga lentils do take a little bit longer. French lentils, it really depends. Sometimes they can cook quicker or less quickly, depending. So, sure, it does depend a little bit on the type of lentil you buy. But for the most part, regular old brown or green lentils, yeah, they cook in 20 minutes. They're very fast, very easy to work with, and just, again, such a great source of nutrition.
So I had this other question from Helen, and she said, should nuts and seeds be soaked and rinsed prior to use? And I'm wondering if she's confusing that with beans or lentils, because with lentils, typically you kind of rinse them and pick out like, oh, there's a little rock in there perhaps. But nuts and seeds, what's kind of your method for incorporating those into recipes?
Yeah, I think I know what Helen might be referring to, which is this idea that there are these enzyme inhibitors in nuts and seeds, things like phytic acid or other enzyme inhibitors, and that can actually block some of our absorption of nutrients. The idea is that if you soak nuts and seeds and then possibly even dry them and sprout them, you are taking away a lot of the enzyme inhibitors. I think it's a step you can take, and if it makes sense to do it in a recipe, great, right? So I often soak cashews before adding them to creamy sauces, and that's not really because I'm thinking about the nutrition. It's more because when you soak them, they're easier to blend up into a sauce. So that's why I do it. I don't know that there's any really strong body of evidence that nuts and seeds become much more nutritious if you do soak them first and rinse them off before eating them. I think probably you get plenty of the nutrition if you don't take that step. So I would put that into the category of you certainly don't have to. If you want to, it's a personal choice. If you just feel that that's going to help you optimize the nutrition of the nut or the seed, go for it. But it is an extra step, and, we're all busy people. Time is precious. So I would say I don't know that there's any hard evidence that that's something you have to do in order to get the nutrition from the nut or the seed.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And Kath wanted some quick and easy vegan recipes. So let me just kind of get into your spring panzanella salad. So, I'm looking through the book. I'm like, gosh, what should I make? And I actually did make your tofu, black beans, and rice recipe with greens. And I did that like a month or two ago. Simon, my college son, was coming home with some of his buddies. And I'm like, I need a big pot of food for these boys. So that recipe was great. And then last night I made your spring panzanella salad because, hooray, it's finally spring.
Yeah.
And I love this recipe. And just, for my listeners, it was great because A, it's, a spring recipe. So everything's in season. But it was so easy because you called for asparagus, which I cut into 1-inch pieces. And then I just blanched the asparagus. So, just a few minutes in a pot of boiling water. And then you called for peas, frozen peas, and I got petite peas because that's kind of my preference. Mm-hmm. Those went in, just blanched those quickly with the asparagus, drained that. And then the recipe was so easy because it called for greens. It called for a can of chickpeas. Again, I drained and rinsed them. It called for a jar of artichoke hearts, marinated artichoke hearts that I chopped up. It called for homemade croutons. You could get store-bought if you don't want to go that route. I used whole wheat bread for that. And I know I'm missing one thing. And then I made this dressing. I'm going to go to your book quickly. And then your dressing was made with lemon juice and fresh dill and olive oil, a little bit of Dijon mustard. And it was so easy to make. And it was so springy and beautiful. So I love that recipe.
Oh, I'm so glad. And I love that you chose those two recipes because I feel like they show the whole spectrum, right? Like one of them is very hearty. It's like a good recipe to feed a crowd. It's a giant one pot meal, and that would be the tofu and greens. And then the panzanella is just light and bright and springy. It's perfect for when the weather is getting warmer. And yeah, it's just such an easy thing to whip together. You can use whatever bread you've got in your fridge or homemade if you have it, but certainly no need to. You can use a can of beans, and it doesn't have to be chickpeas. It could be white beans. It's such an easy one to mix up and modify as needed.
And that panzanella salad, I just peeked at it, and I did recall all the ingredients in it. So that's what goes in it. And I do love the versatility. And I feel like, for me, when I make a recipe, I used to have this habit of making a recipe from somebody else's cookbook, and I would modify it from the get-go. That's silly. Now I make it as is. And then the second time I make it, I can kind of modify. So yeah, adding a different type of bean, or adding a different vegetable, or adding a third vegetable. If you call for 2 veggies, make it 3. So I think starting with someone's recipe is great. And then you could start to kind of play with it. You get inspiration, right? And then you can experiment.
I totally agree. And in the beginning of Power Plates, I actually quote, and this is directly taken from Ina Garten. She says in one of her books, I always recommend making the recipe as written first so that you know what it's intended to taste like. Once you know what the intention is, absolutely, just run with it, make it yours, modify as needed. But I do think starting with the recipe as it was meant to be made, just so that you have a sense of what the real sort of concept was, it's a great place to start.
Yeah. And in the book, you give people a primer on, what to put in your pantry. And, even things like tofu, you're going to tell people how to work with tofu, right? I mean, you're just when I make tofu recipes, I'll drain the tofu and I'll kind of slice it. I'll pat it dry. And, there's certain things, those basic, it's like that, like you said, there's that learning curve before you can really jump in head first. Do a little research, figure it out. So I just want to tell everybody that I discovered you because I tend to go down the rabbit hole, when I'm online. I'll find a recipe. I'm like I was obsessed with sweet potatoes. I was roasting them and then I was topping them with beans and, avocado and cilantro. And I was on this jag for the longest time of just stuffed sweet potatoes. So I start Googling, who else has, stuffed sweet potato recipe? And I find you. And I see you've done this recipe for Food 52, and now I'm completely obsessed with that recipe. And so I'm who is this Gena girl? And, I Google you, and, it's so fun to just find people that way, just through a recipe. But you have this connection to Food 52. And actually, Amanda Hesser, who's one of the founders, I interviewed her years ago for my first podcast, Cooking with the Moms. Yeah. So we go way back. And so I see you've got this connection to Food 52, and you sort of shared earlier, you've written a book for them. So what's the Gena Food 52 connection?
So that I was a columnist for them for a really long time. I had a column for their site called The New Veganism, which I started in 2012. And the book that I did with them just emerged out of the column. It was a combination of recipes, fan favorites from the column itself, and then new recipes that were created for the cookbook itself. So I haven't been a regular columnist in a long time, only because with grad school and the internship, it's been a time where I need to sort of cut back on some of my writing. But I definitely loved writing that column for a while. It was so great to bring more vegan recipes to that site. And the book was just a delightful collaboration.
Good. Well, I will continue down the rabbit hole, and I will be sure to check that out. So in your book, you have main dishes, bowls and plates, no desserts. But I know you make vegan desserts. So what is Gena's number one favorite vegan dessert in the world? What is it?
Probably chocolate cake. Any cake, honestly. I mean, cake is my absolute all-time favorite dessert, and I tend to like a plainer cake, so a bundt cake with a glaze, or just a simple chocolate or vanilla cake with one layer of frosting. My cake tastes tend to be quite simple, but it is cake without a doubt. I would take cake over ice cream. I would take cake over pie. I would take cake over cobbler. I love almost all vegan desserts. There are very few that I will not make and enjoy plenty, but cake is my number one. Okay.
And the frosting, what do you make it with? Say chocolate frosting.
I would make that with vegan butter. I like to use Earth Balance. There are plenty of options on the market these days, but Earth Balance has always been my go-to. I like the product a lot. And I would whip that up with confectioner's sugar the way you would do for normal frosting. I would do the vegan butter and an organic confectioner's sugar and just whip that up and have fun with it. Add some cocoa powder, vanilla, or whatever I was going to do with it.
And I will tell you that I don't like pies. I mean, I'll eat pie, but if I had my choice between cake and pie, I'm with you. I would go for cake every time.
Totally cake. And then even within the realm of the sort of fruit desserts, cobbler is my number one, pie is my number two, and then crisp, in spite of how easy it is definitely towards the bottom of the list. I like a hearty cobbler more than a light crisp. So that's how I would rank my fruit desserts.
Okay, well, you and I will differ on that because I'm a crisp girl all the way.
Then, yes.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I might top that with whipped cream. And if I was a vegan, it would be a coconut whipped cream.
There you go.
All right. Well, Gena, it's really been so great having you on the show. And I just didn't want to give it all away because I do want people to go out and get your book, Power Plates. And we are doing a giveaway. Just a friendly reminder to everybody listening that if you head on over to liz'shealthytable.com/podcast and you visit the show notes from today's show, you can enter. It's a U.S. only giveaway. And on the show notes, I'm going to do links to Gena. I'm going to share some recipes from the book. So you'll get kind of a snapshot for the book and all of Gena's, where to find her on the web. Well, actually, why don't you tell everybody, Gena, how people can find you on the World Wide Web?
Oh, well, it is very easy. So it is www.thefullhelping.com. That is my blog. I check in there once or twice every week. And then I am at The Full Helping on social media. So Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. It's at The Full Helping, one word. And that's how you can find me and keep up with what I'm eating and how I'm surviving the dietetic internship and what's going on in my kitchen, for sure.
And when will you be a registered dietitian nutritionist officially? What's your sense for that?
Oh, so I should be wrapping up my rotations in July, probably the end of July. And then a lot depends on how quickly I take the RD exam. My hope is to take it sort of as quickly upon finishing my rotations as possible. I've been at this education for a very long time now, so I'm very ready to graduate, so to speak. But yeah, if it's up to me, I'll be officially credentialed by either late summer or sometime in the early fall, and then just getting back to running my business and working one-on-one with folks and just keeping going with everything else.
Great. Any new books on the horizon for you?
I certainly hope there will be one soon. I made the choice to not even sort of think about it this year because Power Plates just came out last January, so it's actually still pretty new in the world. And with the internship, I just haven't had the bandwidth to focus on writing or recipe creation. And I'm a big believer that, you want every book to feel special and you really want to put a lot of time and love into each of them. So I didn't want to rush myself through the process just for the sake of getting another title into the world. So it'll probably be a little while before another one actually reaches bookshelves anywhere, but it's certainly my hope to have the opportunity to write another one and to just keep folding together my love of food and a real culinary sensibility and a real passion for food together with this sort of vegan nutrition and just making resources that are both celebratory about food but also practical and offer some good nutrition guidance.
Well, let us know in the future when your new book comes out. And we'll have you back on the show. And I look forward to meeting you, hopefully at our big annual conference in Philadelphia. If you're there in October, we'll look for each other.
All right. If I'm there, I will certainly look for you. And in the meantime, thank you so much for having me here and having me be a part of your community today. It was so much fun chatting and sharing our mutual love of all these delicious ingredients.
Well, thank you for being on the show. And you shared so much great information. And hopefully we'll get you back here down the road. Thanks, Gena.
I hope, Liz. Thank you.
Okay. And for all my listeners today, I really appreciate your tuning in. If you love the show, please post a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts. You can head on over to liz'shealthytable.com/podcast. Check out the show notes from today's show. It will be packed with great information. Enter the giveaway. And until next time, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.